G'day there, you're watching the Aussie BIM Guru, and today we're going to cover the second part of my tutorial series on making materials in Autodesk Revit. So today we're looking at custom materials, so making your own special materials. In our first session we looked at the basics, so if you need to brush up on the basics, feel free to watch the first session, which I'll link at the end of this video. In the next session we look at managing a shared material library and then some advanced techniques at the end. Okay, so we'll look at why we use custom materials just very briefly. Typically they're of higher quality because you can use larger maps than the Autodesk defaults. Autodesk materials are made to be optimal, so they're meant to be focused on good performance from a software perspective rather than a rendering perspective, but they're still pretty good. And then we're looking at also just material data consistency, so you can embed keynotes and tag data inside of materials, which I'll show you today as well, which can let you company standard code your materials as they come out of a shared library, such as one that could be on a centralized server for everyone to access on a shared material library, which we'll cover in the next session. So without further ado, we'll jump into a demonstration. So we're working today with just a basic Autodesk model. It does have mostly a full set of materials applied to it, but they're relatively limited in their quality and how suitable they are for rendering. So for example, I'll show you in the end at Enscape how some of these materials look. But some of them just come out almost plain white, so they're not suitable. On the roof, it's just a flat color, for example. So we're going to look at a variety of materials today, basically just typical architectural defaults. We'll do some more generic ones first, like a concrete, and then we'll move on to other things after. So probably the first thing I'll show is probably a material with seaming issues, because in the last tutorial I mentioned that seaming is a problem if you're not careful. So we'll go to our material editor, and we'll start making some new materials. The first one we'll make will just start from the default material because it will be very similar in structure in the asset properties to what we'd want for a generic material. The material browser can be quite slow to load, I find, and sometimes it will tell you it's not responding or it's crashing while it opens, because it is quite graphically heavy performance-wise, so don't panic if you see that. Okay, so I'll just make that a bit smaller. Actually, I'll probably make it a bit larger, so I think that's the point of the tutorial. Okay, so these are all our materials in the project. So what we'll do is we'll just grab the default material and we'll just duplicate this and we'll just call this a sanding study. And if we go to the appearance asset, duplicate it just so it's a new asset, just call it seaming study. So instead of color, we'll hook up an image to this material. And the image that we'll use is under a folder I've just made with a nice looking texture that, you know, on the surface probably looks relatively convincing as a high-res texture, but it doesn't seam properly. So if I end up looking at a planar representation of this material when it loads, if it loads, actually I'll just go into the actual project environment and show you it instead, because the graphics are taking a while to catch up with me. So we can search in our paint tool. I don't usually advise the paint tool, it's just being used as an example here. Realistic mode. Looks like our material map's not loading, we'll just double check why. Seaming study. Okay, image didn't properly load. Looks like our setting didn't commit. Let's try that again. We'll just rename the asset instead, given it's a generic one. Okay, we'll try that again. There we go. So if I go to planar, so you'll see that's really obvious where the material map is ending. So the material is not convincing in that you can see exactly where the shadows end. And that's really just because at the borders of the material, there hasn't been consideration paid to how this material continues. So just be mindful when you find material maps that you always need to test that to make sure. But instead, let's look at making a roof material first, just a really basic material. So what I've got is a bunch of maps that I've downloaded from a website, basically a V-Ray material website that's quite popular, called V-Ray Materials by Chaos Group. Everything on here is basically released for use, so everything here is good to use, and it's usually high resolution textures as well. And whilst the materials are made for V-Ray, we can still take advantage of most of the maps that they provide. So you know, we can quickly turn a diffuse map into a bump map with just a tiny bit of work, and obviously specular maps as well for reflections. So we'll take that roof Or actually, we'll just keep working on this seaming material now instead and just make it a roof. So usual materials, I like to put their category first, or what they are, and then, you know, what they are after that. So roof shingles type 1. And usually I like to put something common in front of them, so that when I put all my materials in a model, they all stack together and all the Autodesk defaults basically sit around them instead. What we'll do first is give this a surface pattern. We'll make it a model pattern. And I'm just going to load in a custom texture for it, assuming I'm doing roof shingles. So I've actually just preloaded a texture I built earlier, just a shingles pattern. And we'll just make that like a grey colour so it's not standing out too much. And what we'll do is we'll just take the name of this and we'll make a new appearance asset. And we'll load in an image that we've got for this material, which is our slate tiles. And we should probably check the size. So our texture is only 300 by 300, so that's quite small, and we've really got roughly 5 by 6 at the moment. So let's say we want our shingles to be roughly 200 by 200, so we want this to be 1 meter by 1200, so 1 meter wide. So we unlock our sample size, 1 meter by 1200, and this will increase the scale of our overall texture. So now it should be much larger, and we can change the scene that we're looking at it in as well. And there you go. So you can see that like the seaming's not incredible in this material. It is a little bit too obvious in some areas what's happening, but that's okay. It should do for now. We'll load up a gloss map as well to our specular, and we'll just make sure that's also scaled at the same ratio. So every map needs to be coincident in scale. From there we can also add we can try and use a bump map. So we can try and use the displacement map as a bump map. Sometimes this sort of gets the job done, but probably won't be that great in this case. So with a bump map, typically you have to nominate how deep the bump's impact is. So if I just go to a spherical display, you can sort of see the bump taking effect there. You can see it getting a bit more rough. Obviously if I make it very intense, you really start to see the impact that a bump has on the material. You can see that grit really coming out. But I find bumps usually around 30 is about the most I like to go. I find beyond that it gets a little bit too intense. And you can also tint the material too if you want to give it a bit more darkness beyond that. So you could say I want it to be a bit more grey than what my base texture is as well. You could also infuse colour at this point as well and fade your image as well if you find that the material is a bit too strong. So I found this material was too strong. So what I do is just take it down to maybe 60%. Okay, so we've made a roof material now. So we'll go and add that material to the roof instead. So what we'll do is we'll just take this paint off the roof. And if we go back to hidden line mode, you'll see the surface pattern will come into play once we add it. So if I just go to my roof, and we'll just take off the, actually sorry, I selected the wrong element there. We need this instead. Okay, so we'll just replace our roofing on top here with our material that we made, and because we put ABG in front of it, it's right up the top, so it's easy to find. Okay, and you can see that shingle material is now coming into play. And if we go to realistic mode, you'll notice that it's pretty decent of a material. It's getting the job done. And depending on the direction that you want your material to face, you could rotate it. I've seen a lot better materials for roofing. I mean, the seaming's not great, so it's usually a lot of trial and error. So let's say we want to make all our walls brick, or just maybe this particular wall we want to make it brick faced. At the moment it's a concrete cladding, but we'll turn it into a brick face. So we've got some maps for a brick material as well. And I've also got a drafting pattern and a model pattern that I've set up already. I do have a tutorial where I show you how to build model patterns and drafting patterns separately. So we'll just make a new wall type. And I'm being a little bit rough here. Obviously you'd be more careful in real life. So if you want, we can just for now work with the same thickness of layer, even though it's not true and correct. That's okay. So what we'll do is we'll just start from our same material, and we'll just do brick type 1. So for our surface pattern, we want to load in our custom model pattern. So we have a special one just for that. So that's this one here. Notice the size 76 by 225. So we'll use that. And then for our cut pattern, we want to use a custom drafting pattern to achieve that brick pattern. There you go, so that's that typical brick texture. And usually I like to make cut patterns black and surface patterns grey. So if we edited this texture at this point, it would actually impact our roof because we're using the same asset. So you might have recalled I showed that in my last tutorial. So what you need to do is actually duplicate it, repurpose the asset, and then we can begin working on this instead. So we're going to bring in our brick texture instead. So what you can do is just click on this name here, and that lets you repath somewhere else. And we're just going to check how many bricks we're actually looking at in this pattern when we load it as well, because we need to scale it to our pattern. You can see here the seaming is actually quite average on this one here, so that's a bit of a shame. We'll try a different brick that I had actually. That brick's quite poor. So I think we had another. Oh, we had a block, so we'll use a block instead. Because I think the seaming looked like it was going to be a bit better on this one. Yeah, so the seaming's actually almost flawless on this one. So let's say instead we're just going to do block work. So I'll keep the brick pattern on there still, but we'll just load over another texture instead for block work. It's a bit of an easier scale as well. It's 200 by 400 blocks. So at the moment we have I think 2 blocks wide, and it's actually a different pattern of block, but we can just scale this to fit. So let's just say this is 1, 2, 3 blocks overall. So we'll say this is 1200 high, which is correct, and this is 2 blocks wide, which is actually 800. So we need to untick this and then reactivate our scale. Sometimes you need to type both numbers in before you rescale, because one of them tries to correct itself. So it's 8 by 12, and then we'll get probably in this case we might not add a spec map because we don't really want our block work to reflect that much, so we'll just let it be a little bit glossy. We'll say it's got maybe 20% gloss, and we'll make the image take full effect here instead of letting the color come through. And then we'll just add a bump as well. So for the bump, I don't recall if there was one here, but I might show how I set up a bump. So the bump here is not quite suitable. It's a displacement map instead. So we're just going to go into Photoshop instead, and we're going to process this image. So what I usually do when I create a bump map is I desaturate the image, and then I go to levels, and we can basically resample the image to change the black and white balance to get more of an accurate bump. So really what we want is we want to accentuate these, and we want to accentuate the grit on the block. So you can see in this case, this would probably be too much, for example, because the whole surface of the block would be rough. This is about right. So I'd probably still make the mortar a little bit deeper, but in this case that will do. So we'll just take that, bump, okay. So we'll go back in and we'll just load in our bump. And again, we need to make sure that's scaled correctly as well, 8 by 12. Okay, in this case we'll probably take off our tint as well, just to do a standard block. So you could add a small amount of reflection if you wanted to. We could say that it has no direct reflections and it reflects 5% oblique, just so you get a little bit of light coming back off the surface of the block if you so chose. Depending on how honed your finished surfaces, obviously every material is different. Sometimes it's good to make sure your texture's aligned as well. So you can see here that our material is not quite aligning, and I think that's because of the course spacings that we have, in that you've got a half course and a whole course. So it should hopefully coincide roughly still. It just means that every second course might not land on the pattern. Okay, so now you can see that's taken effect. And if we go to realistic mode, you'll see that the real pattern comes into effect. Obviously the spacing's not quite there, but that looks pretty good actually. So if you ever need to check the quality of a material, you can go into ray trace mode to see an actual render of it. It can take a little while, so this might take a little while to render out. I'll just let that go in the background, and we'll just look at another material that we can look at now. So we'll actually look at a floorboard material. So we'll look at something that's got a little bit more reflection, and we'll apply this internally as well. And then we'll look at a carpet, just to look at another bump map application. So it looks like it's still rendering out. It has to process all the light, and it also processes the whole scene. So sometimes you might want to use a section box to limit how much you can see in a particular scene before you hit the big red button, as I've done here. But once it starts, you'll roughly see it in quality. So there you go. So that looks pretty good, and it looks pretty high resolution as well. And you can see the bump sort of taking effect on those mortar lines. So it adds a bit of realism to the scene. So that's an example of another material. So what we'll do now is we'll add floorboards internally. So I think in this particular model, the floors are divided depending on whether you're inside or outside. So we'll just do an isolate category on our floors and see where they're in use. So we might just take this one and just turn it into a floorboards type. Obviously the floorboards themselves aren't 150 millimeters, but I guess you only see the surface in this case. So we could start with a variety of different materials, but in this case we're going to start with our default material still, but we're going to go and use an asset that's different this time. We'll start with default and we'll just call this ABG Timber 1. Obviously you can pick more detailed material names if you so want. In this case we're going to pick a surface pattern as well. So I do have a floorboard pattern that I've built for this application. I think it's 100 by 1800 with a staggered spacing. 180 by 1800, okay. So I'll just use that. And we won't worry about a cut pattern. Again, I'll just set this to mid-gray. Okay, so we need to make an asset now, so we'll duplicate this. Actually, no. What we'll do now is we'll search for a timber asset, because timber assets are a bit special. So we'll go find a wood asset and see what we have in the default library. So we're just going to start with the birch material. And you'll see that what I have available is quite different. They've simplified the interface. You might have seen in my last tutorial when I spoke about how certain assets are customized to suit the material application. It can be a little bit limiting depending on what you're looking for, but I find that these can be quite good in terms of narrowing down what you have to think about. So we've duplicated this asset, we'll make a new one. For the image, we'll go and navigate to our image file that we've set up specifically for this. So I'll just go grab that floorboard material. Okay, great. And we know it's 180 by 1800. In this case, I'm just going to do a square texture depending on the number of floorboards. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15. Okay, so do a bit of quick maths. 15 by 180. So we're going to be looking at a 2700 by 2700 space. Okay, we might need to unlock this. You can see what happens if you don't unlock your texture size before you change it. There you go. In this case, we don't have a bump as well, so we'll just really quickly set up a rough bump. Timber's a little bit more difficult. Usually you have to draw the lines in Photoshop to get a really good bump out of it. So we're just going to go for a very rough bump that's more so going to give just a bit of texture to the wood grain itself, but it won't express the depths of the board too much. So we'll just bring our white point up a little bit. So it's only going to add the tiniest little bump for now, because we're going to do a pretty smooth floorboard finish in this case. Alright. So we're going to add, actually that's our floorboard finish, whoops. Okay, so we need a relief pattern. So basically you can do based on wood grain as well actually, so maybe we'll just do that. And we'll just do a very subtle one. I find 0.1 is more like a polish, and we want semi-gloss or glossy varnish. In this case we won't make it too strong, so we'll just go semi-gloss, and it's used for flooring. And this basically tells the floor how to behave after that. So this should be suitable for flooring. You can see the reflections are automatically calculated on the varnish quality, basically. So actually I might do satin varnish. I quite like that actually. I don't like the reflected floor. Okay. So now we have floorboards downstairs, and upstairs, let's do carpet. So we might actually go and add a layer of carpet to this one just so it doesn't look too silly if we see the underside of it in a render, and we'll just add a 10 layer of carpet on top. Okay, so we'll just go and make a carpet material. We'll just start from one of our other generic assets because carpet is usually better as a standard asset. So you usually want to add like customized bumps and make it look a bit more fairy. Okay, so we'll just take off the pattern in this case. We don't want to see any surface pattern on our carpet, and we don't want to see any surface pattern here either. Okay, and we'll just duplicate this asset. And I've got two types of carpets here that we can use for a demonstration. I think today I'll probably use this one. It's just a plain carpet. But whilst this is quite plain, I've actually added like a more furry bump map that we're going to apply at a different scale, which is going to give the illusion of a deeper carpet when we actually look at it in Enscape at the end. We will go to Enscape at the end, so if you are waiting for that, I promise it'll be pretty cool. Okay, so we go carpet, and we'll go carpet 1. And this one we probably want to apply roughly at a scale of maybe 600 to 900, depending on how dense you want your carpet weave to look. And we're going to apply a bump in this case, and we're going to apply that more furry bump in this case, but we're going to apply it at a smaller scale because you can see that it's quite a small sample. So we'll go maybe at a size of 3 by 3, so that you get 4 of those for each tile. And if I just expand that, you might not quite be able to see exactly what it looks like, but it's got a bit more density to it. Maybe not quite the right scale. Maybe we'll try a little bit larger and try bumping up try increasing that bump a little bit. And there you go. So you can start to see that sort of that weave look coming out of the carpet. It looks a bit more fuzzy, a bit more deep. But bumps are obviously only telling the light how to interact with the surface, so they're not perfect. You can't always get exactly what you want out of them, and we want to turn off reflections off our carpet as well, because obviously our carpet doesn't want to reflect at all. Okay, so we'll just go okay on that. And if we have a look at our materials now in realistic mode, you will see that, you know, they are actually coming through now as textures and looking a lot better than what we were seeing before. Okay, so I think there's a few special materials I was going to show at the end, just to show a few different assets in action. One of them was going to be chain link fencing, because I know that's a common query that people give to me, saying, how do I do a chain link fence if I so want to? So usually for a chain link fence, I find best practices, you make it a wall type or a curtain wall type, and you make it a very thin wall. So we'll just take our concrete wall and then just duplicate it to make it a 5mm chain fence. We'll just make it 5. Okay, so we're going to go to our concrete cast in situ. We will actually upgrade the concrete at the end as well, just to show you how to do a good concrete. Actually, let's do it right now. So you can actually take a material if you want to actually just uplift its quality everywhere. And you can just literally go and find this asset. So if you go to document assets, you can basically search for assets available in your document. And let's just say we want to actually literally replace this asset altogether. So renaming it here won't actually create a new asset, it will actually just overwrite the asset's name, and anything using it will be repathed to that name. So in this case, we're going to go with an image for our concrete. So I have a relatively high quality concrete available. I believe it's this one. Yes. I'll just double check yes, this is it. And this one you can apply on a pretty big sample as well, because it's quite a nice looking texture. Oh, whoa, way too big on scale. We'll just do 1.5 meters. Actually, maybe, yeah, we'll try 1.5 meters, see how it looks. Okay, so finished bumps, we can typically just apply an image as well. So this is a concrete asset. Again, it behaves a little bit differently in terms of how it's configured. The material's a little bit smarter and knows how concrete should behave. So if you give it just a few things to work with, it will do a lot of the heavy lifting for you. Okay, concrete. And we'll just apply that as well. Just make sure it's scaled to be the same as well. So you can see a lot of common steps I'm sort of walking through each time that each material requires. You can apply weathering if you want to as well, if you so want. And other than that, you can apply a sealant quality to it as well. This will be good for like a generic concrete. It may not be suitable if you want something that's a bit more nice, like a polished concrete. So you may have certain preferences, in which case I'd recommend you use like an expanded asset, one that has all these map channels available. Because you notice here I can't put in reflections, so I couldn't do a polished concrete floor if I so chose. But you do have, I guess, certain qualities of what you can just do to the floor itself. So if I just make a scene in here, such as a wall which has a chair, you can roughly see that it's coming out quite nice. So we'll just say that all our concrete is polished in our scene. But what we were really going to do was go and make a chain link fence. Got a bit distracted there. So we're going to go back and we're going to duplicate an asset that has all the channels that we need. So we'll just do heavy G chain mesh type 1. Usually I like to put type 1, type 2 after it, because it means you can keep making more variations on a material without interrupting your naming convention. So we'll duplicate that asset. Notice I'm not really changing these fields, but you could add descriptions, keywords, etc. if you wanted to. If you want your library to be more friendly once you put it together. Okay, so we'll go and find our chain link fence. So basically I've got a few textures available here. I've got the diffuse, what it looks like, opacity or cutout, and then reflection and bump. So we've got a lot of information for this one. Okay, so this is our diffuse channel. And let's just say we want this to be about 450 by 450. It's a pretty wide spaced chain link fence. Not quite right. So it looks like, because I want it to be roughly square, so sometimes you can just play with it until you're happy with how it looks. 350 by 450. We'll make it a bit smaller. We'll just go 300 by 200. Yeah, that looks about right. So 3 by 2. Okay, and notice at the moment it's not quite doing what we want yet. See how you still got a white material? So that's not ideal. Obviously our bump is still there as well. So we want our image to be maximized. We want to use a gloss. We could use a gloss or a reflection map actually. How about we use a reflection map in this case? And we're just going to say from an oblique perspective, none, but from a direct reflection perspective, we'll go with the specular map. And we'll just say that our scale again is 3 by 2. And then after that, we want to basically apply, we could apply a bump, I guess. It's quite overboard adding this many channels to a material. I'd say it's probably too many for a Revit material. This is more for like a 3D Max or a really high quality rendering software material that really wants all these channels, but you can add quite a lot if you so choose into a material like this. It depends on how heavy you want your materials to be. What we're going to do is apply our cutout map now. So basically a cutout map, if you watched the last tutorial, you recall that everything that's black actually gets cut out of the material. So at that point, our fence becomes wire. So you can see the effect that has. And now we have a real chain link fence when it renders, which is pretty cool. You could apply a model pattern to that as well and a transparency. But that more or less achieves what you want. So if I go to realistic mode, you'll see I end up with a mesh fence. It's a bit hard to see because there's a lot of stuff in this scene. But there you go. So you can see that's actually going to render like a chain link fence. So it's quite realistic. So that's how you can achieve that without actually going to the bother of modeling an actual chain link fence, because that's obviously very over the top if you did that. So we'll just leave that there as just a little demonstration item when we go and render. Probably, I'm trying to think if there's any other materials that are worth showing just to show you the possibilities of what materials can do. I think that's probably a majority of what's worth showing. Maybe just we'll do a more textured material such as a tile, just to show you that some materials can look quite nice from a texture perspective as well. So Revit's capable of handling image files. So we'll just go in here and we'll just add let's just make all these walls a tile material. So we'll just go to materials and we'll create a tile material with a bit of reflection because we want to see how this looks in a render as well. So we'll just start with our carpet material and we'll just make this tiles type 1. Duplicate the asset. Okay, and then we'll add a texture. Again, this material has quite a lot of assets available. Sometimes it helps to check the aspect ratio of the files themselves. So we can see this is 1920 by 1053. So we might actually literally just work with that for now. 1920 by 1053. So the seaming's not great on this texture, unfortunately. So looks like some of the materials coming from the vray.de website aren't perfect for this purpose, unfortunately. But we'll press on with it anyway, just so you can see the gloss at least coming out of it. So we'll make it a little bit glossy, but we'll give it some oblique reflections. So we'll give it just the smallest amount of direct reflections. But for our oblique reflections, we'll tie in our specular map. Okay, so again, 1920 by 1053. I think it'd be nice if Revit gave the option to tie all these maps together in size, so that you didn't have to tell each one by one what it needs to be. That would be quite helpful. If anyone from Autodesk happens to watch my tutorials, feel free to tell your boss. If not, I'll just keep complaining on the forums. Okay, 1920 by 1053. Okay, so now we should have a tile material that should look relatively solid. Obviously those reflections are actually almost taking the whole image out, which is quite surprising. So I think that reflection map is probably coming on a little bit too strong. Direct reflections 100%, that'll do it. Okay, so we'll just take that down to about 10% direct reflection. Okay, so now we have a tile material. So we'll just paint some of our walls with that material so that when we go into our rendered scene, we can see it in action. We'll just paint this wall. We won't go in our bathroom, we'll just paint a couple of the walls in the house so that it's easier to see. Okay, so that's a few just custom materials and how you can set them up. The last thing before we render them is just to show you how you can manage data. So under the Identity tab, you're able to add a description to your material and also a class. So for example, this is a floor tile. So there's a lot of options of what you could say it is. You could say it's ceramic, or you could also say it's I guess a finish. There's a limitation to how many things this system has, which is why I don't usually get too caught up in what's in there. Sometimes you could say it's stone if it's a stone tile. Let's just say it's ceramic this time. And obviously we can call it a floor tile system. It's just all text-based, so you can put anything you want, comments, keywords. But what's really useful is the keynote field. So we could say floor tile type 1. And if we just okay that, so anywhere we have that particular material, actually before I move on, one last thing to show you too before I tag this, is if you want to change the shade of the appearance, you can always just say use the color that my material reaches overall, but obviously that's quite dark, so you may want to then release it and amplify this by maybe 40 in each slot, so 102 and 127, and that would give you roughly the color. And I guess we could obviously have a surface pattern as well. I'm just going to pick one that's not quite scaled to the texture, and there you go. That's something that's a bit more representational of the actual material itself when you're in shaded mode. But what we're going to do now is just really quickly tag this element. So we might just make a keynote. I think there's a keynote in here by default. So we want to use a material keynote. Okay, we need to lock the orientation of our view before we can keynote. There's no keynote families, so we'll just load in a. Actually, I'll just make a new keynote family really quickly so you can see how the tag needs to be set up. So we'll go new family, and we'll just go family templates annotations, and we'll just make a keynote tag. That may not be available in your library. You may need to go back a few versions to find the keynote tag template. I think they took it out of 2018 and 2019 for some reason, which is quite frustrating. So we'll just make our key value, and then we'll just load this particular tag into our project. And you can see it's searching for the keynote of the material. And if it finds a hit, we'll just actually use a material keynote first, because this one won't find any hits, but look at that. Floor tile type 1. So it's basically a sensitive tag that will tag the nearest thing under it. So obviously if I tag this and then I put a wall in front of it, sorry, I'm in locked mode, so it's a little bit tricky. If I put this in the way and then move this around, it will try to tag the surface that it's placed closest to. So just be mindful of that behavior. You can always leader them if you need them to be on a specific element. But obviously that gives you a system where you can tag things in a live manner. So you could tag in an internal elevation, for example. What we'll do now is we'll actually just go into a rendered environment and have a look at some of these materials and how they came out. I can't guarantee they're all going to be perfect, so I have rushed this a little bit. If you do use Enscape or are aware of it, one great thing that you can get out of Enscape is if you make sure that your grass material has the word grass in its name, or is grass, and you have a look at maybe its texture and how it looks, and make sure that its color is something that's relatively grassy and not too dark. Maybe this will actually generate dynamic grass in Enscape. So what we might do is we'll boot up Enscape. If people haven't used the software before, I highly recommend you have a look into the trial. And it's a purchased software, but totally worth it if you market your design to clients and you need to engage them in the environment that you work in, because this allows them to fly around and walk around in the model space, or you to guide them through it by piloting. And it supports Oculus headset as well, so it's quite an impressive tool, and there's a lot of features that this can do. I might do a separate tutorial on Enscape itself. Okay, so we're now in our model. So we're just going to start flying around, and we can already see some of our materials in action. We're just going to be closer to our model. So some of them turned out all right. The roof shingles aren't great, but I'd say the block with a little bit more work is quite a decent blockwork material. It's probably not, the bump isn't coming through quite enough, but I'd say the timber's looking great. So you can see that's the timber floor that we set up. and I quite like that. That's quite a subtle timber, but it's nice. It's nice and clean. I think it was a good choice not to go with the polished look. I think that was a bit much when it was polished, so that was a good choice. And you can see the dynamic grass in action. So if I get up to a junction with another material and just let my computer catch up with me, you can see it's actually climbing up the side here. It's not perfect. Some areas the dynamic grass does behave a bit strangely, but that's pretty good. Also, Enscape does support RPC as well. So you can see here an RPC element coming out in the model, which is pretty impressive. And let's go find that timber wall, or that tile wall, I should say, that we brought in here. There we go. There's our tile walls. Obviously the seaming is, you know, quite dreadful, but the texture itself is quite nice, and it probably needs a little bit of direct reflection. I probably took too much direct reflection out, but at least that's how you can get a custom material in. And I believe our concrete may be in use around here somewhere. I think our concrete might be outside here. A bit hard to tell actually. It may not actually be in use anymore because I replaced the concrete with carpet. Actually, I think this might be our concrete in here, or is that no, that's a carpet. That's a default carpet, so we'll keep walking past that. I think I put our carpet upstairs, didn't I? So we'll just go upstairs and check out our... there we go. There's our carpet. Whoa. There it is under our feet. And you can see... Whoa. Getting a bit lost there, I know. There you go, it's down there. So you can see that that's really come out, and that texture is really coming through quite well. I mean, obviously when you get right up to it, you can see that the texture has no depth to it at all. But the bump effect is actually quite good, and when the light picks it up, it actually looks like real carpet. So I keep toggling walk and fly mode, and it's not quite letting me land where I want to. There we go. So you can see that that's a really convincing carpet effect we got out of that. So just a few materials and how they can be set up, and ultimately how they can be used for visualization purposes to improve the quality of your model. There's obviously a lot more materials you can create, and there's a lot of materials I've created myself, so that's just an example of some of them. We'll try and find that chain link wall. It doesn't seem to have rendered out properly, so I'm wondering if maybe Enscape has trouble with cutout maps, possibly, or is it just a single-sided material? Yeah, it's a single-sided material, so we might need to go and paint the other side of that. But there you go. There's that chain link texture coming out. So that's pretty cool as well. So you can see that's quite a convincing chain link wall actually. Obviously no design intent behind it at all, but that comes out really well too. So just an example of what can be done. I think the concrete may be on the underside of this soffit actually. I think that's our concrete that we're seeing there. So it's probably a little bit too plain. Probably the polish is taking too much out of it. What you can do in Enscape, that's good. Right before I finish this tutorial, I'll just show you all that grass is very loud. We'll just go find our concrete that we set up down the other end, and we'll just stop polishing it because I think the polish is probably what's taking a lot of that. We'll just do a straight broom finish. Just double check that that's going to come through. Cool. So as materials update in Enscape, or as surfaces update in Enscape, so too will your scene. So if I just go here and I paint this little piece of floor with my concrete material, or I just paint this piece here with my timber material, and then I go back to Enscape, it should dynamically retrieve those actions. Yeah, so there's is that our concrete material? Doesn't look like it retrieved that action actually, but typically it's meant to. I might have not set it to dynamically update, but I could always reboot my session and go from there. I might just quickly show it just before I finish up. But that's pretty much, I guess, the demonstration finished. I sort of went on the fly there, you noticed I had to jump around a little bit here and there just to cover a few topics, because materials are quite complicated. But I recommend that you sort of experiment with establishing a few custom ones for your office. Because the next step is to build a library. So obviously if you don't have many materials, the merit of a library isn't there. But otherwise, that's pretty much what we were going to look at for today. So it looks like we're back in our scene. So now we can just quickly check out our concrete again. If you're in Enscape, there's usually a button that speeds you up. I think it's a shift key that makes you walk a bit faster if you're finding that you're moving a little bit slowly through the model. And there you go. So there's our concrete material, and that's a pretty nice concrete. The seaming's not too bad. It's pretty convincing. So that's quite good. And I find that, glass, for example, comes out quite nice in Enscape. This one probably could use a little bit more reflection. But overall, I think our scene's quite improved. I think the timber and the carpet are probably the big wins. They're the ones that really worked. But it's all trial and error as well. Keep playing when you use them. But otherwise, that's the session for today. If you've got any questions or suggestions, feel free to leave them down below. And if you've got any questions, always ask me on any videos. I'm always happy to take any topic requests as well. So feel free to follow and subscribe me if you haven't already. And if you're enjoying what you're seeing, hopefully I'll see you in the next video. Thanks. Take care. Bye.